What is up, guys? It's the Sound Alchemist, part of One Mind Syndicate, and today I'm back to talk about Warhammer 40k. So I've been told countless times that Mephiston is one of the most overpowered space marines that there is. Now, talking about overpowered space marines, I know those pretty well, because one of my favorite space marines that I like to play on the battlefield is that of Caldor Draigo. Draigo is probably the most Mary Sue of the Mary Sues out there. This guy took out Demon Mortarion in an extraordinary fashion where he literally carved his fallen commander's name into Mortarion's heart. Now, if that doesn't say overpowered space marine, I don't know what does. So let's see if Mephiston can top these extraordinary feats of Draigo in today's 40k lore. So this excerpt comes from Mephiston, City of Light, but for now, let's dive into this 40k lore. For centuries, Mephiston had harnessed powers that went far beyond the standard librarius disciplines, but since his second rebirth, he could wield them with a subtlety he had never dreamt of. As the laser blast ripped through the gunship's hull, Mephiston's mind leapt into action. His thoughts moved at such an incredible speed that his world around him slowed to a glacial crawl. He stepped outside of time and allowed his thoughts to wander lazily over the rest of the gunship. He was too late to save the pilot. The man's skull had already crumpled, but there was also damage to the landing gear and 2 missile launchers. A fuel line had been severed, but the fusion reactor was still intact, and was most of the hull's ceramic plating as well. The shot that killed the pilot had entered through the front oculus. It would pass through Anthros's head next, but a few milliseconds after that, the Pansensoro would lose its artificial atmosphere, and with a brief dramatic fireball, spit its passengers into the void. Mephiston unfastened his harness and rose from his seat, moving through a blurred motion collage. The air trembled with a groaning howl. It was a fraction of a sound, truncated and left howling in outrage at being held in stasis. Other than Mephiston, the only movement in the cabin came from a blizzard of shadows that tumbled around him as he approached the dead pilot. Fascinated, Mephiston reached out, trying to grasp one of them. His gauntlet passed through it, but he had seen this before, and he knew this was no trick of light. He was seeing echoes of other dimensions. By stepping outside of natural temporal constraints, he had become interspatial. Was this glimpse of the warp, he wondered, seen from another angle? Or was it another place, so foreign as to be beyond such concepts? He stared into pools of darkness, trying to fix the shapes, but it was impossible. Every time he thought he had seen something familiar, a face or a piece of architecture, it dissolved into something baffling. He shook his head, trying to steady his thoughts. Sidestepping time was dangerously alluring. There had been times in the past where he had lost whole months examining one incomprehensible detail. Blood angels were long-lived, even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes, but Mephiston knew that every moment of his span was a blessed resource. He fixed his gaze on the pilot's shattered skull. The man's head was a cloud of blood and gray matter, glistening and bulbous, like a grotesque blossom. While Mephiston had been examining the shadow of the laser blast, he had already moved on, progressing another inch towards Anthros's rigid face. Mephiston reached out and clasped his hands around the lethal beam, extinguishing it with a muttered phrase. Then he turned his attention to the damaged ship. It was an easy enough matter of knitting together the molecules of the oculus. The glutted scythe was strapped to his armor in a gilded reliquary, a repository of every blood rite and discipline he had ever mastered. But he had no need to refer to the text. He mouthed the incantation from memory as his fingers weaved contrails, warping and igniting the elements until the screen was intact. And when this was complete, he strolled around the ship, fixing the other damages with effortless psychokinesis. He then looked back at the pilot's exploded head and wondered if there was anything he was incapable of. From the day he became Mephiston, beneath the ruins of Hades' hive, his abilities had grown, outstripping anyone else in the Librarius, perhaps any other psyker in the galaxy. But since his second rebirth, under the knives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the growth had accelerated. While QVO-87 dismantled his body, Mephiston's mind had been elsewhere, performing another act of remaking. He had bound a darkness into his soul, absorbing the savage heart of the Blood Angel's curse. The warp had showed him a black angel, a terrifying manifestation of the chapter's rage, and he had harnessed it, drawing its danger and power into the newly tempered soul. Now he felt as though there was no law of nature that he could not overturn. The idea was troubling but dizzying. Whole lifetimes had been spent codifying the difference between sanctioned psychic powers and heretical sorcery. But surely the distinction lay in the source of the power, not the application. He walked to the dead pilot and let his hand hover over the man's obliterated skull. The pilot's head was thrown back at an unnatural angle, and Mephiston could see his dull, staring eyes. He gazed into them, then through them, into the space that had been his mind. Mephiston felt a mix of excitement and concern. He could see an echo of the man's final panic thought. He could see the moment at which he realized a Xeno fighter had lopped around and was about to fire on him. Mephiston cradled the echo and asked himself a dreadful question. Could he bring the man back? Necromancy. The word resonated in his head. Of all the deeds that might be considered ambiguous, necromancy was not one. It was exactly the kind of heretical warpcraft that led to many to denounce the librarius. He merged his own mind with the echo of the dead one and realized that he might be able to do it. He might be able to restore the spark to its owner, to create life. Mephiston shook his head. What really were the dangers of such an act? The galaxy holds many dangers, said Racilus, quoting from the scrolls of Sanguinius, and chief amongst them is power. Mephiston looked back at his friend in surprise. Racilus was still motionless, but somehow he had followed him into the interstitial realm between seconds. No, realized Mephiston, he had not. The words were a memory. He was recalling a warning that he gave him years ago. The quote had rung so clearly in his head that it sounded like he was addressing it to him. He nodded and lowered his hand, letting the echo die. Suddenly Mephiston saw that while making him safer, QVO-87 had also made him far more dangerous. When everything is possible, nothing is safe. The potential for harm he carried was incalculable. If the chief librarian of the Blood Angels were ever labeled a necromancer, what would that mean for the chapter and its successors? By reviving one man, he could doom an entire legion. Mephiston looked at the pilot's ruined face and realized just how deep a chasm he was traversing. He returned his thoughts to a more immediate concern. He had extinguished the laser blast and repaired the gunship, but they were still surrounded by swarms of Xeno fighters. The next attack would only be seconds away. He cast his mind through the ship's hull and saw that 7 attack craft were currently facing the ship, their guns about to fire. As he studied them, he sensed the limits of his power. Even now, he was not omnipotent. The galaxy was leaning its weight against him, willing him to resume his proper place in its continuum. The grinding sound grew louder and louder, and though the elements themselves were about to snap back, he would not be able to keep himself apart like this for much longer. He dropped his mind into the skull of the nearest Xeno pilot, and this time, rather than examining the psychic being, he examined its physicality, studying the rangy muscles, the ligaments. He thought on a molecular level, feeling the heady rush of the Xenos' pulse. The blood rush caused Mephiston to gasp. Gene-bred hunger flared in his throat, and he had to recite mantras to calm himself down. Working at a distance while simultaneously holding himself apart from the now flow of time, his psychokinesis would not be powerful enough to attack the Xeno fighters or immolate their pilots. He would need to do something on a smaller scale, something easier to achieve. The Xeno's pulse continued to stroke his bloodlust, giving Mephiston an idea. He allowed his mind to sink into the vitae, enveloped by the corpuscles, then worked into the same way he had done when fixing the Storm Talon's oculus. He knitted cells together, binding and mending them to his will. The molecules began to clump together, forming a clot. He was sure it was large enough, and Mephiston thought himself across the void into another pilot's blood. He repeated the process, creating yet another blood clot. Then he jumped away, again and again, until he had performed the same act in the bloodstream of every pilot. He ensured every clot was positioned so as to be fatal the instant the Xeno's hearts began to beat again. At this point, Mephiston re-entered his flesh, glad to be back in his own hulking, gene-enhanced frame. Free of the baffling thoughts that circled his head, he fastened his harness and muttered a quiet oath. The galaxy shuddered back into life. There was an explosion of noise as he re-entered time's violent slipstream. The Storm Talon blanked wildly as the controls nodded against the console. The ship tumbled and rolled until Mephiston reached out with his thoughts, past the dead pilot, and steadying the controls. "What happened?" cried Raceless, staring at the blood-caked cabin. "Mephiston." "I was too late to save the pilot," he replied, "but fast enough to save the rest of us." Respect flashed in his eyes as he saw the Xenos fighters drifting away, their pilots slumped dead at the controls. And there you have it, guys. This is pretty crazy stuff. I can see now why you would think that Mephiston can be one of the strongest warriors out there. Now, let's not get it twisted. Ahriman is still a contender to be probably one of the best psychers. We also have Magnus the Red, and of course, the Big E, the Emperor. Those guys are probably all stronger than Mephiston, but at the same time, the things he can do here are just astronomically insane. Basically pausing time, or at least slowing it enough to the point where he can mend the ship from a laser beam, extinguish the laser beam, basically kill all 7 pilots through blood clots, and I'm pretty sure he could have done it. He probably could have brought back the guy whose head was blown clean off. So that is pretty crazy stuff, especially where you look at like the Primarch novels, the Magnus one. Magnus is doing some crazy shit with his psychic abilities, as is Ahriman, astral projecting and burning up pilots and stuff like that. Here we see almost the exact same thing, but on a whole different level. So with that being said, let me know what you guys think about Mephiston. Are there any other instances where this guy seems to be super overpowered? And what other Space Marines can give him a run for his money? So that's all I got for today, guys. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And as always, it's been the Sound Alchemist, part of One Mind Syndicate. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.